The dust cloud appeared on the horizon just as the morning sun crested the mesa, casting long shadows across the barren landscape of Cedar Creek. Martha Coleman stood on her porch, shielding her eyes with a weathered hand, watching the lone rider approach her homestead. The wind carried the scent of sage and distant rain, promising relief from the drought that had plagued the valley for 3 long months. Her heart quickened not from fear, but from hope. The roof had been leaking for weeks now, each storm sending rivulets of muddy water into her parlor, and her late husband's tools remained untouched in the barn. She'd grown accustomed to placing tin buckets around the house, their metallic pings creating a melancholy symphony during the rare desert downpours. The rider drew closer, revealing himself to be a tall man astride a paint horse, his weathered leather chaps and silver spurs catching the early light. His face was bronzed by years under the western sun, framed by sandy hair that had begun to show threads of silver at the temples. Something in his posture spoke of gentleness, despite his rugged appearance, the way he held the reins loosely, the careful way he guided his horse around her struggling vegetable garden. "Morning, ma'am," he called out, touching the brim of his worn Stetson. "Name's Jake Sullivan. I was passing through when I noticed your roof might could use some tending to." His voice carried the slow drawl of a man who'd spent years in the saddle, moving from town to town. Martha felt a flush rise in her cheeks. She'd grown unaccustomed to male attention since Samuel's passing 2 winters ago, and this stranger's kindness caught her off guard. "I appreciate the observation, Mr. Sullivan, but I'm afraid I can't pay much for such work." Jake dismounted with fluid grace, his boots hitting the packed earth with a soft thud. "Wasn't looking for payment, ma'am. Sometimes a man just likes to be useful." He gestured toward the sagging corner of her roof where several shingles hung loose like broken promises. "Besides, looks like rain's comin', and no lady should have to sleep under a leaky roof." By noon, Jake had stripped away the damaged shingles, revealing the extent of the roof's deterioration. Martha watched from below as he worked, noting the careful way he examined each board, testing for rot and weakness. Sweat darkened his blue cotton shirt as he moved across the roofline with surprising agility for a man who appeared to be in his 40s. "You've got good bones in this house," he called down to her. "Built to last. Just needs some tender care." Martha brought him a pitcher of cool well water and a plate of cornbread she'd baked that morning. As he climbed down to accept the refreshment, she found herself studying his face more closely. His eyes were the color of winter sky, pale blue with flecks of gray, and when he smiled, deep lines appeared at their corners, laugh lines earned through years of finding joy in simple things. "You're mighty kind, Mr. Sullivan. Not many folks would stop to help a stranger." "Jake's fine, ma'am. And beggin' your pardon, but kindness ain't so rare as folks make it out to be. Sometimes it just needs the right circumstances to show itself." He drained half the pitcher, then wiped his mouth with the back of his hand. "If you don't mind me askin', you been managing this place all on your own?" A shadow crossed Martha's face. "Since my Samuel passed, we never had children, so it's just been me and the land." She gestured toward the small plot behind the house where she'd been struggling to coax vegetables from the stubborn soil. "I'm afraid I'm better with indoor tasks than farming." Jake's gaze followed hers, taking in the wilted corn stalks and struggling bean plants. But what caught his attention was something else entirely. A small cleared area near the back fence, where the earth had been recently turned and carefully tended. Even from this distance, he could see the tiny green shoots emerging from the soil in neat, deliberate rows. "Those roses?" he asked, pointing toward the patch. Martha's entire demeanor transformed, a soft smile lighting her face like sunrise. "My grandmother's climbing roses. I managed to save some cuttings before." She trailed off, but Jake understood. "They're just starting to take root. It's probably foolish, trying to grow roses in this climate, but they're all I have left of her." The afternoon sun blazed overhead as Jake continued his work, but something had shifted in the atmosphere around the small homestead. Martha found herself lingering outside longer than necessary, bringing him additional water, adjusting the clothesline that didn't need adjusting, checking on her roses with increasing frequency. There was something comforting about having another person nearby, the sound of hammer against nail providing a steady rhythm that made the place feel alive again. As Jake worked, he found his own attention drawn repeatedly to the woman below. Martha moved with quiet grace around her property, and he noticed how her face brightened whenever she knelt beside those tender rose shoots. She spoke to them in soft tones, as if they were old friends who needed encouragement. "Those roses mean a lot to you," he observed during another break. accepting a cup of coffee she'd prepared. My grandmother raised me after my parents died of fever. She always said roses were proof that beautiful things could grow anywhere if they had enough love and patience. Martha's voice carried a wistfulness that spoke of deeper loss. She used to say that some folks are like roses too, they just need the right soil and someone who believes in their blooming. Jake set down his coffee cup and studied her face. Sounds like a wise woman, the wisest I ever knew. She passed just before I married Samuel. Said she could go in peace knowing I'd found good soil to put down roots. Martha's eyes misted slightly. Samuel loved those roses too. Every spring he'd help me tend them, and every fall we'd plan how to expand the garden the following year. A comfortable silence settled between them. Jake understood the weight of such memories, the way lost love could simultaneously wound and heal. He'd known his share of loss during years of wandering, though he rarely spoke of it. As the sun began its descent toward the western mountains, Jake secured the last of the new shingles. The roof looked solid now, ready to face whatever storms might come. But as he prepared to climb down, his eye caught something that made him pause. Near the horizon, a dust cloud was rising too large for a single rider, too organized to be wild horses. "Ma'am," he called down, his voice carrying a new edge of caution. "You expecting company?" Martha shaded her eyes and peered toward the approaching dust cloud. Her body tensed as she made out the shapes within at least a dozen riders, moving with purposeful intent toward her homestead. In this remote corner of the territory, such groups rarely brought good news for isolated settlers. "Apache?" Jake asked, his hand instinctively moving toward the Colt revolver at his hip. "No," Martha replied, her voice tight with recognition and something that might have been old fear. "Worse, that's the Brennan gang. They've been terrorizing homesteads throughout the valley, taking what they please." She turned to Jake, urgency making her words tumble together. "You should go, Mr. Sullivan. Ride out the back way. They'll be here soon, and they don't take kindly to interference." But Jake was already climbing down from the roof, his movements deliberate and calm. "How many men in this gang? 12, maybe 15. Led by Brennan, he's got a reputation for cruelty that reaches clear to Denver." Martha's hands twisted in her apron. "They came through here 6 months ago, took most of my livestock and threatened worse if I didn't have something valuable waiting next time they passed through." Jake checked his rifle, then looked around the property with new eyes, assessing defensive positions and escape routes. "What did you tell them you'd have ready?" I told them about Samuel's silver pocket watch. It's all I have of value, but I hoped maybe it would buy them off." Her voice dropped to almost a whisper. "But it's not enough. Men like that, they're never satisfied with just money." The riders were close enough now to make out individual faces, hard men with the look of those who'd chosen to take rather than earn. Brennan rode at their head, a massive figure in a black duster, his face scarred from an old knife fight and his eyes holding the flat coldness of a predator. Jake stepped closer to Martha, his presence solid and reassuring despite the approaching danger. "Ma'am, I need you to listen carefully. When they get here, you tell them I'm your hired hand, been working here all week. Let me do most of the talking, and whatever happens, don't mention those roses." "The roses? Why?" "Trust me on this," Jake said, his pale blue eyes meeting hers with an intensity that made her catch her breath. There was something in his expression, not just determination, but a kind of quiet confidence that spoke of a man who'd faced such situations before. The Brennan gang thundered into the yard like a plague of locusts, their horses' hooves churning up clouds of dust that settled over everything like a gray shroud. Brennan himself was even more intimidating up close, well over 6 feet tall, with shoulders that strained his black coat and hands that seemed too large for the reins he held. A jagged scar ran from his left ear to the corner of his mouth, a memento from some long-ago violence. Well, Mrs. Coleman," Brennan called out, his voice carrying the false joviality of a man who enjoyed others' fear. "Hope you've had time to gather up that watch you promised, and maybe find a few other treasures while you were at it." Martha stepped forward, her chin raised despite the tremor in her voice. "I have the watch, Mr. Brennan, just as I promised." Brennan's pale green eyes shifted to Jake, who stood casually beside the porch steps, his thumbs hooked in his gun belt. "And who might this be? New husband already, Martha? You work fast." "He's my hired hand," Martha replied quickly, following Jake's instructions. "Jake Sullivan. He's been helping with repairs around the place." One of Brennan's men, a thin scarecrow of a figure with nervous eyes, leaned forward in his saddle. Boss, that name? Jake Sullivan. Ain't that? Shut up, Crawley, Brennan snapped, but his own demeanor had shifted subtly. His eyes now studied Jake with the calculating attention of a predator, recognizing another predator. Sullivan, is it? You wouldn't happen to be the same Jake Sullivan who used to ride with the Texas Rangers, would you? Jake's expression remained perfectly neutral. Might be. Rangers take on all kinds of temporary help. Man's got to eat. The tension in the yard ratcheted up several notches. Even Martha could feel the change in atmosphere, as if the air itself had suddenly become thicker, harder to breathe. Several of Brennan's men shifted nervously in their saddles, hands moving closer to their weapons. Brennan dismounted with deliberate slowness, his boots hitting the ground with heavy thuds. See? That's interesting, Sullivan, because I heard tell that particular Jake Sullivan had quite a reputation with that cult of his. Course, I also heard he disappeared a few years back. Some say he went soft, started avoiding trouble. Jake smiled, but there was no warmth in it. Well, you know how stories grow in the telling. Man gets older. Sometimes he just wants a quiet life, fixing roofs and mending fences. His hand remained casually near his gun, but Martha noticed the subtle way his stance had changed. Feet slightly apart, weight balanced on the balls of his feet. The standoff stretched like a taut wire ready to snap. Brennan studied Jake with the intensity of a man trying to read another's true intentions, while his gang spread out in a loose semicircle, cutting off obvious escape routes. Martha felt her heart hammering against her ribs as she realized she was witnessing something far more dangerous than a simple robbery. You know what I think, Sullivan, Brennan said, beginning to pace like a caged animal. I think maybe you ain't as retired as you'd like folks to believe, and I'm wondering what a man, with your particular skills, might be doing at a lonely homestead like this. Before Jake could respond, young Crawley spoke up again, his voice high with nervous excitement. Boss, I'm telling you, that's the same Jake Sullivan who took down the Hutchins brothers in Abilene. Single-handed. They say he's the fastest draw between here and San Antonio. Brennan's scarred face split into a cold grin. Is that so? He turned back to Jake. Well then, maybe we should find out if those stories are true. What do you say, Sullivan? Care to show us how fast that iron of yours really is? I'd rather not, Jake replied evenly. Like I said, I'm just here to fix a roof. But Martha could see the terrible inevitability building around them like storm clouds. She stepped forward, clutching Samuel's silver watch in her trembling hands. Please, Mr. Brennan, here's what you came for. Take it and go. There's no need for anyone to get hurt. Brennan barely glanced at the offered watch. His attention remained fixed on Jake, and Martha realized with growing horror that this had moved beyond simple robbery into something personal. A test of reputation and pride that men like these seem to value more than life itself. See, that's where you're wrong, Martha, Brennan said, his voice dropping to an almost conversational tone that was somehow more menacing than shouting. This has become about respect, about reputation. Can't have word getting around that Brennan backed down from a has-been lawman. He gestured toward his men. Boys got to eat. And fear's what puts food on the table. Can't maintain fear if folks think we're soft. Jake's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. Your quarrel's not with the lady, Brennan. You want to dance with me? We can dance. But she stays out of it. Oh, but that's where you're wrong again, Sullivan. Brennan's grin widened, revealing teeth stained yellow from tobacco and neglect. See? I'm thinking, maybe Mrs. Coleman here is more than just an employer to you. Maybe you got yourself invested in this little spread, which gives me leverage. The bandit leader snapped his fingers, and 3 of his men dismounted, moving toward Martha with casual menace. But as they approached, something unexpected happened. Jake didn't draw his gun. Instead, he stepped backward, placing himself between the advancing men and Martha's small rose garden. I wouldn't step on those roses if I were you, he said quietly. Brennan's men paused, confused by Jake's odd concern for a patch of struggling plants. Even Brennan himself looked puzzled, his predatory grin faltering slightly. Martha watched in bewilderment as Jake continued to position himself protectively near her grandmother's rose cuttings. Roses? Brennan laughed harshly. You're worried about flowers, Sullivan? Maybe those stories about you were greatly exaggerated, but Jake's expression had changed, becoming almost serene. Those particular roses are very special, Brennan. They're all this lady has left of someone she loved. Now, I've killed men for stealing horses and cattle, but damaging something that precious. He shook his head slowly. That's the kind of sin a man carries with him. One of the dismounted outlaws, a bearded giant named Morrison, sneered and deliberately stepped toward the rose garden. Maybe I'll just stomp on every last. The gunshot came so fast that most witnesses would later swear they never saw Jake's hand move. Morrison's hat flew off his head, and he stumbled backward, eyes wide with shock. The bullet had passed so close to his ear that a thin line of blood appeared on his cheek. Next one won't be a warning, Jake said, his Colt now steady in his hand, still aimed at Morrison. I told you those roses were special. The yard erupted into chaos. Brennan's men went for their guns, but Jake was already moving, using Martha's porch for cover while his Colt spoke again and again with deadly precision. Martha threw herself behind a water trough as bullets whined overhead, splintering the porch posts and sending chips of wood flying like deadly rain. But something extraordinary was happening. As gunshots echoed across the valley, riders appeared on the horizon, not more outlaws, but a cavalry patrol that had been tracking the Brennan gang for weeks. The sound of gunfire had drawn them like a beacon, and now they came thundering toward the homestead with sabers drawn and rifles ready. Brennan realized immediately that the situation had turned against him. Mount up, he roared to his men. We're leaving. But Jake had other plans. As Brennan swung up into his saddle, Jake's next shot took the bandit leader's horse in the leg. Not a killing shot, but enough to bring the animal down, pinning Brennan beneath its weight. The cavalry patrol swept into the yard just as the remaining outlaws tried to flee, surrounding them with military precision. Captain James Morrison, ironically sharing a name with the outlaw Jake had nearly shot, dismounted and surveyed the scene with professional satisfaction. Jake Sullivan, the captain said, extending his hand. Been a long time since Fort Laramie. Heard you'd retired from active duty. Jake holstered his weapon and accepted the handshake. Was trying to, Jim. Some folks just won't let a man fix roofs in peace. As the dust settled and the cavalry secured the captured outlaws, Martha emerged from behind the water trough, her legs shaky from the aftermath of violence. The entire gunfight had lasted less than 3 minutes, but it felt like hours had passed. She looked around her yard. Bullet holes pocked her porch, her chicken coop had been shattered by stray shots, and her carefully maintained vegetable garden was trampled into ruin. But her roses remained untouched. Captain Morrison finished binding Cole Brennan's wounds, while 2 troopers secured the bandit leader with chains. We've been tracking this gang for 6 weeks, the captain explained to Martha. They've terrorized homesteads from here to the Colorado border. Thanks to Sullivan here, we finally got them. Brennan glared up at Jake from where he lay pinned. This ain't over, Sullivan. I got friends, family. They'll come looking for you. Jake knelt down beside the wounded outlaw leader, his voice soft but carrying clearly across the yard. Let them come, Brennan. But they better understand something first. This lady is under my protection now. Anyone who threatens her, threatens what she's trying to build here, will answer to me. And next time, I won't be aiming to wound. As the cavalry prepared to transport their prisoners to the territorial courthouse, Captain Morrison pulled Jake aside. Territory's still got need for good men, Jake. Badge, steady pay, respect of the community. What do you say? Martha found herself holding her breath, waiting for Jake's answer. In the space of a single morning, this stranger had fixed her roof, defended her home, and revealed himself to be far more than a simple drifter. But she also sensed the loneliness in him, the restlessness of a man who'd spent too many years moving from place to place without putting down roots. Jake glanced toward Martha, then at her small rose garden, and finally back at the captain. Appreciate the offer, Jim, but I think maybe I've found something worth staying for. His eyes met Martha's across the yard, and she felt her heart skip like a stone across still water. The captain grinned and clapped Jake on the shoulder. Can't say I blame you. Good luck, old friend. As the cavalry patrol rode away with their prisoners, an almost magical quiet settled over the homestead. The crisis had passed, but Martha realized that everything had changed. The shy widow and the wandering gunfighter stood in her yard, suddenly alone together, both uncertain of what came next. Your roof's finished, Jake said finally, gesturing upward toward his completed work. Martha looked up at the sturdy new shingles, then back at the man who'd given her far more than just shelter from the rain. Would you like to stay for supper? It's the least I can do after all you've done. 3 months later, the first of Martha's roses began to bloom. Jake stood in the early morning light, coffee mug in hand, watching as tiny pink buds emerged from the climbing vines that now covered nearly half of the back fence. What had started as a few struggling cuttings had transformed into a thriving garden, with new shoots appearing weekly, and the original plants growing stronger and more vibrant than Martha had dared hope. "They're beautiful," Martha said, joining him in the garden. She wore a yellow cotton dress that caught the morning light, and her hair was pinned back with a ribbon that matched the roses. The drawn, worried expression that had marked her face when they first met had been replaced by something softer, more peaceful. "Your grandmother would be proud," Jake replied, setting his coffee aside to examine a particularly promising bud. In the months since the confrontation with the Brennan gang, he'd learned to tend roses with the same careful attention he'd once given to his weapons. His hands, scarred from years of hard living, had proven surprisingly gentle with delicate petals and thorny stems. Their relationship had grown like the roses, slowly, carefully, with patience and mutual respect. Jake had built himself a small cabin on the back corner of Martha's property, close enough to help when needed but far enough away to preserve propriety. The arrangement had raised eyebrows in Cedar Creek, but the local preacher, Reverend Williams, had quietly assured the community that both Jake and Martha were people of good character, deserving of their support rather than their gossip. The garden had become their shared project, a symbol of something beautiful growing from difficult soil. Together they'd expanded the original plot, adding varieties that Jake remembered from his childhood in East Texas and others that Martha had read about in seed catalogs. They'd built trellises and irrigation channels, composted kitchen scraps and horse manure, and spent countless evening hours planning the garden's future expansion. "Jake," Martha said, her voice carrying a note of nervousness that made him look up from the roses. "There's something I need to tell you." His heart clenched slightly. Over the months, he'd grown more content than he'd ever thought possible, but part of him had always expected this peaceful interlude to end. Men like him, with violent pasts and dangerous reputations, weren't meant for lasting happiness. "The bank in Cedar Creek foreclosed on the Morrison place yesterday," Martha continued. "Their daughter, Sarah, and her 3 children have nowhere to go." Jake relaxed, realizing this wasn't about him leaving but about Martha's generous heart extending itself to others in need. "You want to take them in? The house is big enough, and Lord knows I could use the help with the expanded garden. But," she hesitated, twisting her hands in that nervous gesture he'd come to recognize, "it would mean we'd need to make our arrangement more official. People can overlook a bachelor helping a widow, but taking in a family requires proper appearances." 6 weeks later, on a Sunday morning when the roses were in full bloom, the entire population of Cedar Creek gathered at Martha's homestead for what Reverend Williams declared the most joyous wedding ceremony he'd performed in 30 years of ministry. Martha wore her mother's wedding dress, carefully preserved and lovingly altered by Sarah Morrison, whose skilled seamstress fingers had become invaluable to the expanding household. Jake had traded his weathered trail clothes for a new black suit ordered specially from Denver, though he'd kept his familiar boots and the silver spurs that had carried him across so many miles of lonely territory. The ceremony took place in the rose garden, with climbing vines forming a natural cathedral around the assembled guests. Captain Morrison had returned for the occasion, serving as Jake's best man, while Sarah Morrison stood beside Martha as matron of honor. The Morrison children, 8-year-old Tom, 5-year-old Emma, and baby Rebecca served as flower children, scattering rose petals along the improvised aisle. As Reverend Williams spoke the ancient words of matrimony, Jake found himself thinking about the unexpected path that had led him to this moment. A year ago, he'd been a lonely drifter with no particular destination, carrying his past like a heavy pack, and expecting nothing from the future but more of the same. Now he stood surrounded by friends and family, for that's what they'd become, promising to love and protect a woman who'd taught him that some gardens were worth tending for a lifetime. "Do you, Jacob Sullivan, take this woman to be your lawfully wedded wife, to have and to hold, in sickness and in health, for richer or poorer, for better or worse, till death do you part?" "I do," Jake replied, his voice steady despite the emotion that threatened to overwhelm him. He looked into Martha's eyes and saw reflected there the same wonder he felt, the miracle of 2 solitary souls finding each other in the vast loneliness of the frontier. When Reverend Williams pronounced them husband and wife, the celebration that followed lasted well into the evening. The townspeople had brought food and music, transforming the simple homestead into a place of joy and community. Children played among the roses while adults danced to fiddle music under stars that seemed brighter than usual. But the most meaningful moment came later, after the guests had departed and the household had settled into quiet. Jake and Martha walked hand in hand through their garden, breathing in the sweet fragrance of roses and planning the additions they would make next spring. Sarah Morrison had put her children to bed in the room that had been prepared for them, and for the first time in months, the house was peaceful. My grandmother always said that roses were proof that beautiful things could grow anywhere with enough love and patience, Martha said, echoing words she'd spoken on that first day they met. Jake stopped beside a trellis heavy with blooms, their pink petals luminous in the moonlight. She was right, but I think maybe she was talking about more than just flowers. Martha smiled and leaned against his shoulder, solid and reassuring in the prairie darkness. She would have loved you, you know. She always said I'd find someone who would help me bloom. Above them, the roses climbed toward the stars, their sweet perfume a promise of springs to come, of children's laughter in the garden, of quiet mornings spent tending growing things together. Jake Sullivan had finally found the place where he belonged, not because he'd stopped moving, but because he'd found something worth staying for. In the years that followed, travelers passing through Cedar Creek would often stop to admire the Coleman Sullivan Rose Garden, which became famous throughout the territory for its beauty and variety. But those who knew the family understood that the roses were just the visible sign of something deeper, proof that love and patience could indeed make beautiful things grow in the most unlikely places, and that sometimes the greatest adventures begin not with riding toward the horizon, but with deciding to stay home and tend your garden. The morning wind carried the scent of roses across the prairie, a sweet reminder that some promises, once planted, bloom forever.